Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you to Andy, Louise, Karen, the whole SEBI team for inviting me here and making me welcome, and also for supporting this process. I want to introduce something I've been working on for probably about 15 years in different forms. Something I've been trying to get people interested in, which is actually, do we have a table where we can actually look at the global impact of animal diseases? And the answer is no, we don't. And it means that basically we end up with a system where we react to things. So if a disease starts killing things, then we start running around and doing things. Avian influenza is a great example of this. We usually then end up doing trade restrictions, and we start to then codify that and actually generate notifiable disease lists. Now that means that when we look at economic impact, we end up with economic impact of notifiable diseases. But even those notifiable diseases, we have fairly poor data about what actually impact they cause. Foot and mouth disease is commonly referred to as the most economically important disease. As far as I'm aware, there's only one study, one that Nick Lyons has led in Kenya, that has actually tried to document that quantitatively with a data set in terms of milk production, fertility, and abortion rates. And that's currently being published in a sort of series of studies, and I hope we'll actually look at the productivity change there. So what does that lead to? Well, people like Will Houston have tried to fill this gap, and it's kind of a nice way to sort of look at it. So we end up with these kinds of charts. But if you look at the underlying cause, which SEBI have already sort of emphasized, that's not based on any kind of published data. It's regularly used for presentations, and it's used in terms of actually influencing policy and investment. Or we go to institutions where we do disease prioritization, leading to possibly things like vaccine development, which we're all involved in this room to some extent. Industry lobby groups influence that process, but invariably your local scientist, your friendly scientist who loves a certain disease, knows a lot about it, will actually push that forward. And very occasionally we might do a gap analysis using discount tools. Anybody's looked at discount tools here? Put up your hand. How much data is there on socioeconomic impact of those diseases? Almost zero, but I can tell you every disease is socioeconomically important in discount tools. That's what it states normally. So there's a kind of gap. There's a gap that means that we do need good impact assessments to create advocacy. We've talked about that a little bit this morning in terms of where we sit with livestock. We need a series of impact assessments to actually look at resource allocation between diseases. And for the big diseases, the big problems we face, we ideally need some kind of idea about how resources are used within the diseases themselves to actually deal with misallocation. Now, I see a problem here, and this is a problem that I face in terms of coming from a background of thinking about economics. Now, I'm glad to see in this meeting that quite a number of people have explained that they're looking at context, they're trying to identify weaknesses, and they're trying to reallocate diseases. But what I normally face in the animal health world is that somebody will come to me and tell me, Jonathan, foot and mouth disease is important, I know how to control it, give me a cost-benefit analysis. Now, there's a difference between those two approaches. The economic approach is looking for optimality, adding value through optimality issues. A lot of the animal health work that I've been involved in is simply looking at advocacy issues. It's actually searching for money to support that process. There's strengths and weaknesses across that piece, but I think our challenge is to bring those two things together, or at least closer together. And obviously that requires us to think carefully about input-output analysis, which is very strongly sort of based in terms of economic impact assessment. We need to make sure we're doing things consistently and comparatively. We're not doing that at the moment because if you do any kind of systematic analysis in this space, you don't come up with very many studies that you can then compare. So we can't really do meta-analysis in that structure. Now, what have we actually got available at the moment? Well, human health is probably about 30 years ahead of us. One or two people have already referred to the kinds of things that are going on in human health. So the global burden of disease, which is run out of the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation, has been going on probably since about the 1980s. And there's also been studies around foodborne diseases. Now, The global burden of disease is now an annual estimate, so it's generating longitudinal data sets. The equivalent in animal health is the World Livestock Data Analysis done by the World Bank. Anybody know how many people did that study? One. I've asked that question to people before in the room. It wasn't very many. So basically, it's a starting point. Now, I think there's issues that we need to pick up on that. So basically, both those studies adopted similar methods, and people have sort of referred to this as well here. Yet they differ enormously in terms of their engagement of the health sectors, and the animal health study was a one-off. Now, I've also got a problem with both these studies. They're not really economics. So both these studies are actually estimating gross loss. Now, we know from the livestock sector, we're under pressure about the environmental impact of animals. So we can't do gross loss estimates. We can't just think about adding more animals. We've got to think about the net loss issues. We're also working in an economic space. So the animals that we keep are kept for a reason, usually an economic reason. So it's important that if we start estimating the animals that are missing or the production that's missing, we actually think about the costs of that in terms of land and water and other resources. If you look on the other side in terms of expenditure on health, and again, human health is well in front of us on this space. There's well-established methods to capture cost data in the human health side. Animal health is lagging behind. In a general sense, we've got the performance of veterinary services tool out of OIE, but it's not carried out consistently, and it's not been carried out globally. So it's not really generating the right sort of data. So coming to the aims of GBADS, I want to move past this sort of ad hoc process of impact assessment. It's been successful with certain things, and we're pretty good at controlling certain diseases. We've eradicated a disease, and we've managed to remove disease in certain populations. But it's a very poor use of economics, and it certainly doesn't actually look at optimal use of resources. And it limits our ability to think systematically about how we develop investments and capacities across the animal health system. So I hope the GBADS program, not hope, I intend that the GBADS program will actually develop a system that regularly collects, validates, and analyzes and disseminates information on the economic impact of animal diseases. The outcomes of that program, I want to see league tables of the burdens of animal diseases. In the medium term, I hope that will allow us to compare where the impact is between diseases, and with the big diseases we've got, to actually look and see whether we've got the right balance of things like surveillance, control, and prevention measures. Then in the longer term, once we start having a longitudinal data set, and people have said to me, it's not very important what happened 30 years ago. Well, I think it is, because actually we've got an opportunity there to actually analyze data and see what we did wrong or see what we did well. But we need data to actually support that process, to actually look and whether our investments in research, our investments in coordination actually make a difference. We can only do that if we've got data on the economic impact of the diseases over time periods. So the basis of this is that GBADS will provide a basis for looking at animal health investments over different time periods. How will we achieve this? And I had a very interesting discussion with Chris Murray about 3 weeks ago, where Shannon was present, who challenged me, what are you trying to measure? It's just a shopping list. Well, for me, it's not a shopping list. Why are you not measuring GDP? Why are you not measuring livestock units? Well, I don't want to measure livestock units because if we're looking at an economic sector, most of this can be brought back to monetary units. We can put prices on things. We have markets for things. But we will need metrics which are different depending on our clients. So some of our clients will be national governments, some of them will be private sector, and some of them will be donors and funders. So we've got to have some degree of flexibility about what metrics we develop. And it's important to emphasize, I'm not planning on GBADS looking at interventions. This is simply setting a baseline across different things. How much is a disease costing in 2018? What will it cost? And in 2019, we do the same estimate again, so we can look at variation. And I'm splitting that up in terms of losses on one side, expenditure and reaction on the other, where we can start to develop some kind of idea about what are we spending on one side and what are we losing on the other side. So this is kind of an economic debate where for every dollar or dong we spend in terms of managing that disease, we are anticipating that we will actually avoid some losses on the other side. But we need to collect data on both sides to get some kind of picture of what we're doing. And of course, that relationship is very strongly influenced by the value we place on people and animals. So we know in different places we have different values for people, different values for animals. Now, that's a bit uncomfortable for the human health world because they don't want to put a value on humans, but it's true. And our investments have to recognize that. But we also know that we can manipulate the price of technologies. So we can bring vaccine costs down if we're willing to put investments in place. And that will change the balance of that investment structure. The cost side is a little bit more complicated in that we will need to think more carefully about fixed cost issues, things like coordination, research, education, and the variable cost things that come with any kind of control process. And obviously there's a relationship there between the loss side and the expenditure side. And this will, I hope, start to build up in terms of different models, different data sets. I'm working very closely with Mario in terms of thinking about bioeconomy models, talking to Tim about the kind of data sets he's using with production systems. Carl, not yet totally involved, but he's definitely in contact with different people in this structure. So various people in this room are taking a role in this. And I've had quite important meetings with Sebi and with GalVmed in the last 2 or 3 months to sort of discuss this. The program itself, we're very much in a sort of development phase with support of the Gates Foundation, but also from BIFID at the moment. And we're looking at how we develop these processes to actually do a rollout in terms of implementation, followed by moving towards outcomes, which I've just talked about, the league table of diseases, allocation of resources, inter and intra, and econometric analysis, leading to policy issues, and some kind of feedback process. How long is that going to take? Well, to be realistic, it's going to take us at least 10 years to establish something reasonable. But I think we can get out some pretty good estimates of global impact of the big diseases probably in the next 2 or 3 years if we work harder. Geographical focus, learning some lessons from the human health side. We'll probably start, we'll definitely start at a global level. There may be some specific country activities, but we'll increase the geographical granularity as we move through the program over the 10-year period. With regards to disease focus, we've already identified a potential list of diseases we're looking at, which you can see on there. I won't read all the way through it, but it's probably only a list of about 12 to 15 diseases we'd actually focus on. But over the sort of initial period of this program, I'd want to increase the granularity of that and possibly include more diseases at country level. Core principles, again, learning lessons from the human health side. Important that we include risk factor assessments in this work, that we build on and add to existing data sets and analyses, which is why I'm here. So I don't want to sort of replicate what LD4D are actually doing in this space. Loss estimates, as I've mentioned before, need to be net loss, not gross loss. So using livestock units alone is not adequate in the space where we're looking at economic issues. And we need to have a methodology where we estimate disease loss envelopes. So how much are we losing in total, and can we attribute that across different diseases? The outputs from this process, multi-level, dimensional. So I feel we need to actually present back metrics around absolute loss and relative loss, loss by different socioeconomic groups. That's something that Neil pressed me on when I went to see GalVmed. How do we look at smallholder farmers, impact on consumers, trade distortions? And we need to have systems that are transparent and parameter estimations that are also transparent. And we will be in a process of accepting and embracing challenge in this process. So where does this sit in the general database structure? People, how many people know WAHIS? not everybody. So this is the World Animal Health Information System. It's currently being revamped with support from the Gates Foundation. And we've been talking very closely with the team doing that. GBADS will sit alongside that. It won't be part of that system, but it will feed off data from that. It will also draw on a range of data of which this community will obviously be very active in. Academic journals, the kinds of work that Louise is pulling together in terms of thinking about disease issues. Private sector data sets. I reckon if you look at the pig, poultry and dairy sectors, probably more than half of the animals we keep globally are under some kind of private sector data set. And we're not really tapping into that very strongly. It's difficult to get to, but I think it's a goal that we have to start thinking about more carefully. Population databases, again, Tim and Mario are working hard on thinking about that. We've got to have price data sets at different levels. And the overall aim is to generate, of course, maps around economic impacts and move that towards a kind of tables where we can look at priorities. And my end goal here is that ultimately we start to influence the OI list of diseases. At the moment, we've got 120 diseases listed there. But if you look at that list, it doesn't always make sense with regards to country priorities. And that's dictating quite a lot of resource flow across the world. What will that look like? Well, we've got various things running across this in terms of informatics, impact assessments, disease prioritization, which Delia Grace is leading, communication, population and production systems that Mary is looking at. And in the background, every one of those boxes will generate educational materials which we need to think about institutionalizing across the piece. What will be the influence of this? Well, Megan Bruce, who's leading the part on disease classification, we're thinking about replicating the WHO disease classification process in the animal health world. Currently, that doesn't exist. So we're not actually classifying disease appropriately. We'll have tables where we can look at resource allocation. We can look at investment, fixed and variable, across the animal health system. And we'll regularly update those particular estimates. So we move from very crude estimates of loss. This is from the World Bank Disease Loss Atlas. And we move towards a picture where we can look at global losses. This is from the Global Burden of Disease and national losses. The color coding here is very important. So you can see in human health at the moment, there's much more burden in the non-communicable disease related issues than there is in the infectious disease globally. Now, what are the implications for that for livestock? Well, we're part of the food system that's contributing to the NCD epidemic. And we don't even think about it. We're so focused on infection that we don't think about the NCD burdens coming out of the food system. So I think that's one thing we can perhaps focus on. With regards to expenditure, we move away from this very crude estimate that I put together with a colleague, Will Gilbert, about 2 years ago, looking at cost of disease expenditure at a national level, to something again taken by the Global Burden of Disease group in Seattle. This is from WHO data, where they can actually specify expenditure over different periods and in different spaces. Now, what will that look like for the livestock sector? Well, this is a quick musing this morning. So perhaps we break it up in terms of thinking about disease impact at a national, regional level, looking at notifiable diseases, looking at endemic diseases, but also including in that nutrition, water, and accidents. And they may well be more important than our infectious disease burdens in some places. And of course, with the information at national and regional level, we can build up a global picture of what those balances look like. At a disease level, I'm intending that we estimate the loss in production, but we can also specify the impact in terms of what we spend, and we can look more carefully at the wider economic impact issues. And then we can take that a little bit further where, so that should say types of producer or person impacted. And again, I've made these things up to be controversial. So it might be that impact is experienced by small-scale producers, but some of the impact may actually be in urban consumers. And some of the impact might be in large-scale producers. But getting those balances right and understanding where that impact lies is quite important. Every one of us in this room is a consumer. I'm not sure how many producers we've got, but everybody is a consumer globally, and actually understanding that our beneficiaries are tend to be consumers is quite important. So we move from what we currently have at the moment, which is an animal health system which basically makes decisions and gets your friendly economist to come along and do some economic analysis, like me. If I get the right number, I keep my job. If I don't, we'll find another economist. To a system where we move to actually having animal diseases with an economic impact assessment. We have impact assessment of the interventions, and we have reasonable animal health decisions. Now, I see this as sort of building from the bottom, again, requiring lots of data across different parts of how animals are kept in society, the disease issues, our prevention and control strategies, but also the disease impact assessment leading towards evidence-based policy making. And the GBADS program fits on one side, and Andy, your project fits on the other. And obviously there's a strong link. GBADS would provide a baseline to actually look at interventions. It would provide data sets to look at interventions and for us to do more reasonable analysis. Okay, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Jonathan. Obviously a big topic, and again, we'll have a chance to pick this up in a working group after coffee, but any quick questions at the moment? Who hasn't spoken? Carl and Odedi.
Thanks, Jonathan. I mean, really nice presentation. 3 quick comments, hopefully, although they're probably a bit provocative, so maybe they're not quick. The first one, I mean, you talk about like the different stages in terms of the different types of analyses, and your long-term analysis was you mentioned econometric modeling, and I'm a little bit skeptical in terms of the ability of that kind of modeling to be able to achieve your goals in terms of looking at expenditure and reactions, because you're not going to capture the feedbacks, the long-term types of behavioral adjustments that actually might occur. Forecasting. The second 2 are probably more provocative. The weighting issue in terms of looking at different metrics is something we would be very careful about, because you have to figure out a way in terms of trying to balance and understand the different trade-offs between the different metrics that you might come up with. And there's a real danger of gaming those kinds of metrics and gaming those weights. So how to actually make this more go for something that can be subjectively construed to something that's a bit more objective and impartial. The last issue, and I love the vision at the end, but there's, and I know in a lot of your work that you talk about sort of the people in the system, and there's a big kind of pink elephant in the room, and that's the vets. Will the vets buy into this kind of system where this is really being driven by more on the economics? And that's always been a point of resistance, as you and I know pretty well. How do we actually get the veterinarians to buy into this?
I think I have the veterinarians bought into it already, so I have almost full commitment from OIE to start with. This is based on a resolution from OIE in 2016 after the technical paper I presented at that particular conference. So it was voted by the member states. Whether they realise what they voted for is another matter, but they did vote for it. With regards biases, go and look at the global burden of disease literature. It's full of that kind of stuff. So the weighting issues around the disability, life years lost, has been changed, and it's still very controversial, so there's lots of things in the literature. And what I'm proposing really is that we're actually a little bit more transparent than the way the Institute of Health Metrics operates, and we actually make accessible the data sets we're using to some extent, so that people can do their own manipulation. So we perhaps be more of an open platform rather than just developing metrics, because I think one of our big clients from this is not the public sector, it's not the donors, it's actually the livestock industry. It's the pharmaceutical companies, it's the feed mill companies. Okay, so they're for me, they drive the livestock sector, They have to make critical investments. They have to report back to shareholders. And we have obviously a big group of farmers that need to make money from what they're doing. I'm trying to think whether I've answered. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I'm open to ideas about how we take forward the thing that you said at the beginning. I mean, you know, I need your expertise to sort of drive that process and make sure we get reasonable outcomes. So let's just keep talking about that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Just a very quick one from Odedi, and then we need to move on. We're kind of running into timetable issues.
Yeah, to make it very quick, I appreciate your attempt to map out the burden of diseases. And as you know, it is probable that most of the diseases are in the developing world. But where they probably are, we don't have diagnostic facilities. So I would be getting the data to map out the burden, because some of the diseases are never diagnosed and becomes a challenge. Because I've seen from the list, CBPP is indicated to be a major burden. But I'm currently working in a project to try to test CBPP and CCPP. But from the pastoralists who are presumed to be having the problem, they don't have any clinical reports of CBPP. But they have a major issue with CCPP. But if you go to the Central Veterinary Lab, they even have a real-time PCR for CBPP, which you cannot get clinical evidence of, but there's no real-time PCR for CCPP, which every pastoralist reports.
I kind of disagree that actually the biggest burdens are going to be in developing countries. I think we'll find that there's lots of burdens in the developed world that are not being properly reported. So there's lots of parasitism, there's lots of expenditure in that part that we don't really understand. With regards, how do we get data? There are pockets of very good data in the LMICs. So there's lots of research projects that are going on that we need to draw on to actually understand a little bit better what's going on. So I visited a project with Hong last week where we have data on disease in small-scale intensive poultry units, with week-by-week data collection, with sample taking, with disease diagnostics actually ongoing. Now, there will be other examples in different parts of the world. We have to draw on those strong studies and actually make some sense and extrapolate across different spaces. It's a challenge, but I think also one of the weaknesses we have at the moment is that we're not giving enough direction to the animal disease surveillance systems to actually press them hard on what kind of diagnostics are they doing, how are they measuring disease, the levels of disease. Many of our surveillance systems at the moment are simply on the yes, no, present or absence type process rather than actually measuring levels. And that's a real problem in terms of actually how we move forward and help people understand better on the investments. CBPP, totally agree with you. Joshua Nono's PhD in this area in Kenya indicated that it wasn't that problematic, and yet everybody talks about it being very problematic. So there are various things we need to sort of think about more carefully in that space.
Great. Okay. Well, we'll pick all that up in a working group after coffee. We have a very special occasion coming up because Gridded Livestock of the World 3 is about to be relaunched, I think. Is that right? Tim, are you going to talk to that? Thanks a lot, Jonathan.